Hey everyone, before we start the show, I just want to get some plugs out of the way. If you enjoy this podcast and you're into wrestling, check out the Nerds and Marks podcast or Marty and Sarah Love Wrestling. If you're not getting your fill on movie and entertainment discussion, then check out the Entertainment Buffet podcast. If you want to dive into the world of video games, I highly recommend the Darkcast by my friends over at darkstation.com. Listen to them cover important topics and interview men and women from all over the industry. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hello everyone and welcome to Shelved. I am your host, Jeremy Meyer. Now I told you that no matter what, we're going to cover a script this week, and although the episode is going up a day late, because I'm literally recording this right before I'm about to post it, I told you we would have a script episode, so that's what we're going to do. And so a couple weeks ago, I did a vote on Twitter to see what kind of script that you would want us to cover next, and I can't remember all of the categories that I put up there, but the one that won was for a drama, like a dark drama. And that was secretly the one I was hoping everybody was going to pick, because this is a script that I have wanted to cover pretty much since the beginning of the podcast. It was one of the ones when I first started collecting scripts. It was something I had never heard of. It was from the Blacklist, which is the Hollywood scripts that are super popular in Hollywood, or people have optioned and just haven't been made yet. A lot of these movies have become, a lot of these scripts have become movies at this point. Like, I know Jane Has a Gun, or Got a Gun, is one that I haven't seen that movie, but I'm pretty sure did not turn out the way it hoped, which is always interesting to see, like when these Blacklist scripts actually get made into movies, how they turn out, because that one obviously doesn't seem to have worked. I'm actually going to look that up real quick and see what the Rotten Tomatoes score is for that. Jane Has a Gun? Yeah, Jane Has a Gun ended up starring Natalie Portman, and the Rotten Tomatoes is 39%. So Roger Ebert, 2.5 out of 4. So yeah, you can see that not all Blacklist scripts turn out good. Another good example is Cop Out by Kevin Smith was a Blacklist script, written by the Coens, I believe, Coen brothers. So yeah, we've covered like one Blacklist script so far on the podcast, so this is actually only the second one we've done. And this one is called Great Falls, and it is written by Andy Friedhof. Hoping I said that right. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, this is one that as soon as I read the synopsis for it, which I am trying to find, I was immediately hooked. I can't believe this hasn't been made, because it is very easy. It wouldn't be like a super expensive film. So the logline is this: after negligently killing a hunter with their patrol car, an alcoholic sheriff's deputy and her superior officer must decide what to do with the only witness to their crime, a death row inmate only days from execution. And I got my cat here wanting to chime in, right? You gonna meow? No? Okay. Why don't you just lay down and not get in the way? Yeah, so Great Falls, it's a really... just that premise was super interesting to me, and that's not actually 100% accurate, because in the movie, no one's an alcoholic. The female main character is a Adderall pill popper, so that's kind of the difference there. But overall, it was really fucking great. This is exactly the kind of movie that I would want to make. It's the kind of movie that I would want to write. It's the movie I would find on Netflix and watch and love, and it's one that would probably fly under the radar for a lot of people, but I thought it was really good. I thought it was really fun. I really wish I could have found somebody who would have wanted to do this one with me, because this is a script I've offered to a lot of people, and nobody was like, what else you got? And I was just like, oh man, come on. But you know what? I'm just gonna do this one solo. Couldn't get anyone who was interested in reading it with me, so let's just check it out by ourselves. So I'm just gonna, I took my notes and I have them here in front of me, and basically I'm just gonna kind of run through the plot with everybody since I don't really have anybody to bounce off of for this episode. I'm just gonna run through the plot and talk about the points that I found interesting. So we are first introduced to Officer Stan, who is a cop, and his partner Josie, who is a deputy, and they are transporting a prisoner whose name is Bernie, and he's being transported to be executed. You know, he's been sitting on death row, they say later, for like 20 years, and they're on their way to drop him off. And so the movie kind of opens on they say it's in Montana is where Great Falls is, and they're just on the road and they're driving, and they stop at a little diner and they're having breakfast, and Stan is kind of kicking around the argument of, you know, the death penalty. Do you believe in it or whatever? And Josie's just kind of like doesn't have an opinion on it. You can clear she just doesn't want to be here. And he's right away he lets us know where he stands. He's like, a killer who is killed doesn't kill again. And, you know, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's hard to argue at that point. So they're kind of debating the death penalty, and she says she doesn't really care, and Stan mentions her dad and brother, which seems to cause some sort of tension with her. We don't really find out until later. So I have a hard time in this kind of opening scene believing that they're transporting the prisoner in just like a squad car, and he's locked in the back, and they stop for breakfast. I have a hard time believing that would be okay. I'm sure they would be on a tight schedule. The prison's going to be waiting for them, and you can't just leave the guy in the car when he's a convicted murderer. Maybe I'm wrong. Any cops listening? Anybody who knows the law? Let me know. I would love to know the truth about that. So before they go, Josie steps into the bathroom and snorts an Adderall off the toilet, you know, like a upstanding citizen. And right away, they just let us know what she's about. And clearly, she has some issues. She's a little standoffish, and that's kind of her character for a good portion of the script. One thing to note that's interesting about the script, if you ever want to seek it out and read it, is there's no real scene headings in the script. Like, it kind of describes the next location wherever they go, and it kind of made it a little confusing, like, because when the script starts jumping around a lot, which it does later, it doesn't exactly tell you where they are. So sometimes I would get lost. It would take a few seconds just to like get a lay of the land of where they are. So it was an interesting way to read the script, and I do think it helped it flow a little better, but it was just kind of hard to follow for a little bit. So we meet Bernie Howell. It's Houle is his last name. And he's the prisoner in the back, and they mention that he's a Chippewa Indian, which doesn't see, it's weird that they point it out and it never actually comes into play in the movie. Like throughout the whole thing, they never bring it up again. But he's in the back, and Stan is driving, and seems maybe a little tired. He's kind of swerving on the road, and he's chatting a little bit in the front, and they asked Bernie, I'm trying to remember what they were talking about, because unfortunately I didn't take a note of what they were talking about. But basically he's kind of like talking shit about Bernie, and Bernie throws it back in his face, and the big insult here is that Bernie calls Stan a failure, and Stan's like, well, how do you figure? And he's like, well, you've been working at this station for 10 years and blah, 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 and you haven't advanced farther than deputy, but the guy running the station is actually, you trained him. So, like, that seems like a failure to me. And it fucking stings him, he gets all pissed. And he keeps leaning back to yell at Bernie. And as he does that, he's swerving off the road a little. And I should point out it's raining really bad. So they're having trouble seeing out the window. And Josie sees somebody on the road, which if you were paying attention, you know where this is going. So they see this guy on the road, and Stan turns around and sees him just at the last minute. And Josie was already reaching over to try to turn the steering wheel so they don't hit this guy. And at the same time, Stan tries turning, and they end up turning against each other, and they don't move, and they end up running the guy over. And it's described really. It's a really good scene, like the way they describe the chaos of the accident. It's, he busts up their lights on the roof of their car. There's a lot of blood. They look back and they see the body and they're like, what was it, an animal? And Bernie's like, I don't think so. So they get out to check it out, and clearly it's, they just ran somebody over. And it's actually pretty graphic the way they describe it. It's like a guy in a hoodie, and then they like roll him over, and like the bottom half of his jaw is gone, and like his face is just like destroyed. So yeah, he's not gonna get up. So this obviously begins the debate. Josie wants to call it in, and Stan doesn't, which to me was interesting. I thought Josie was going to be the one that doesn't want to. So like the way when I was reading the log line it was described, I thought she was going to be the problem one, and that like when it came time for push come to shove, she's like, no, like I'm fucked up and it was my fault. Like I didn't know Stan was going to be the one driving, and it kind of ends up falling on both of them. And he actually, so like when she wants to call it in, he's like, well, no, we would go to jail and blah, blah, blah. And she keeps persisting, and he reaches in her pocket and pulls out her Adderall. Like, yeah, I know about your problem. I never say anything because I know how much you need your job. And basically implies that like if some, like they could try to say that they hit a deer, like hide the body, but obviously the prisoner in the back is going to say something, and he's like, hey, I wasn't going to say nothing, and they don't believe him, or Stan doesn't believe him. Josie's actually like, maybe he won't say anything and blah, blah, blah. But it becomes a problem when a truck starts coming up the road. So Stan very quickly just like, we got to hide the body. So they end up putting the body in the trunk, and this truck driver stops by. They tell him that they hit a deer, and he's like, yeah, it happens. I hit one too. And I should say truck driver is in like semi. He's in a semi truck. And he says that he had hit a deer, and so, but he notices the prisoner in the back, and the prisoner's like beating on the window, like, let me out of here. These people are crazy. And he can't hear him, but he recognizes them because, it's a small area. He's about to be executed. So naturally people are going to recognize him. And so, the cops kind of, brush the man along, and, he just keeps on going. So now they're kind of stuck. They're like, okay, we need to hide the body. And, Stan convinces Josie, I keep wanting to call her Jessie, to call her brother. Now, you remember her brother was name dropped earlier. So they call her brother, and they go meet him. He has like a auto shop, and he's willing to help him because, Josie's family. So they start cleaning up the car, and they decide that they're going to hide Bernie. It's weird that he's a Chippewa Indian and his name is Bernie, but they're going to hide Bernie, and they're going to hide the body, and they're going to go back to where the accident was and then call it in, say they hit a deer and that Bernie ran away, and then they'll figure out what to do with Bernie later. So it becomes Kyle's job to hide Bernie. So, that's what they do. They call it in, they hide Bernie, and we end up finding out that Stan has a cabin, and that's where they put Bernie. But in the meantime, they go there, and the cops come, and they're searching the area, and we actually get introduced to Sheriff. Sheriff, what's his name? Sheriff Tom? Is that it? I'm digging through my notes. Yeah, Sheriff Tom. It's like Tom Doherty, and they keep calling him Doherty, but I don't think that's how you say the last name, so I'm just going to call him Sheriff Tom. So yeah, they're searching the area, and they like, well, we can't have gone far type situation. So when the sheriff's talking to Joe, like Stan says that Josie should say that she's the one that left the door open, basically, or she's the one that let him get away, because nobody would believe like an older veteran like Stan would let him go. So that's what they tell the sheriff, and the sheriff very quickly is like, hey, it was Stan's fault, wasn't it? And we later learn that the sheriff kind of unfairly takes Josie's side because he clearly seems to have an interest in her, and that kind of becomes his story. So yeah, she's like, it was him, sorry, but we just didn't want him to get in trouble, blah, blah, blah. So it falls on the sheriff thinks that it was actually Stan's fault, and they kind of move on from there. In the meantime, Kyle has brought Bernie to Stan's cabin that's like out in the woods and stuff, and he immediately tries to run away. But his hands are handcuffed behind him, and as he's trying to like hold a door closed, like he gets out the front door and holds it closed, and Kyle is pulling on it, and Bernie ends up falling down the stairs. So then Kyle handcuffs him to like a stove. So we get introduced to Bernie's lawyer, Scott, which, really interesting lawyer name there. And he's basically just like, what are you playing at? And blah, blah, blah. But they're just, he's going to say he's going to put in for a stay of execution. Just kind of protecting his client. Honestly, there's a couple characters in this that I think are completely useless, and the lawyer is one of them. He serves like one purpose later in the story, but honestly, he didn't need to be there, but I'll get there when I get there. And then next we're introduced to the next useless characters is Lisa, spelled with a Z, and Josh, her fiance, and they are the family of the victims that Bernie killed. He killed Lisa's parents when she was a young child. And it's we honestly don't find that out until later, but I'm just going to tell you right now that he killed her parents. And then we meet Stan's wife, who is a nurse named June. He goes to see her. Not much kind of happens in her introductory scene, but it's important that she's a nurse, so that's something we'll find out later. And then we meet Josie's mom and her aunt, and her mom has Alzheimer's, and I gotta say that's one thing that always gets me in movies is any kind of mental illness problem. I think when handled effectively, it can be one of the most powerful things to make me feel anything in a movie. And it's handled really well here in a very powerful scene that will come up later on. She kind of comes home and her mom is like just smashing plates, and the aunt's trying to get her under control. And this is kind of her introductory scene of her just like, hey, she has this mom who has problems, and clearly that is part of her like character. And it's implied that Josie used to be a musician and sold her equipment to take care of her mom. She may have even become a cop for that reason. Like maybe she just needed a job and gave up her dreams and became a cop. And, that's how she's taking care of her family. So we jump back to the cabin, and Kyle is just burying the body out in the woods and, talking to Bernie, telling him he shouldn't have run and stuff like that. And, They kind of start to become a little friendly, but Kyle's just trying not to get too close to him. I believe this is the scene actually where oh no, okay, that comes later. Sorry, looking at my notes. Okay, so that's just he buries the body out in the woods, so that's kind of where that little bit ends. Okay, and then the movie kind of takes a little bit of a dark turn here. And I'm not sure if it was implied this way, but this is how it came off to me. So clearly it's established that the sheriff has a thing for Josie, but it's really established in this scene where he gets home and he puts on a CD, which is Josie, but it's like young Josie. And then he's looking at a picture of young Josie, and they talk about his hand is on his leg and it's kind of tapping to the beat. But then all of a sudden it moves up to his crotch, and then it starts rubbing himself, and he unzips his pants. And it's just like, oh, we're going to go here, huh? And clearly he likes Josie now, but it kind of comes off a little like a pedophile because it's like old Josie's voice and looking at a picture of young Josie. I don't think it was supposed to be like that. I think it was just supposed to be he likes her. But the way it's kind of inserted in that scene is really unsettling. It gets dark real quick. That was one of those things like, oh man, I'm not sure that's the way they should have done that. Okay, so where are we? So the sheriff gets a call and saying that they found something at the scene. But the next scene has Josh waking up in bed. Josh was Lisa's fiance. And he goes downstairs to find the paranoid Lisa, because the sheriff had actually told Josh and Lisa. Sorry, I told you that we introduced those characters. I didn't tell you why. The sheriff was telling them that, Bernie had gotten away. And in that scene, we find out that it's been 20 years since his initial conviction. And, they've going through the appeals and everything. And it was just now over. And they were finally going to be going through with the execution. But, he gets away and now she's all pissed off. But yeah, so she's paranoid, thinking that he's going to come back and kill her, and Josh kind of doesn't know what to do. I should also point out that Lisa is very pregnant when this is all going on. So yeah, she is sitting there with a shotgun and gets scared and takes a shot at Josh, and doesn't hit him, but it's kind of one of those moments showing that they're all freaked out. Okay, so the cops, they call the sheriff. They say they found something. He goes out and they found a truck for a hunter. And I didn't put this together until now. The truck they found, I thought it was originally the truck driver that came by, and that they say that he's been reported missing. And I was like, wait a minute, why is this truck driver missing? I'm now understanding the truck belongs to the hunter that they hit. So that's kind of a hanging thread that kind of went over my head the first time I read this, that I am now putting that together, reading my notes. So yeah, they found the car and he's been reported missing. So now they know that there's something else going on out there. So then we cut back to the cabin, and Kyle is, playing cards with Bernie, and they're kind of betting, and he's uncuffed Bernie and they're drinking, which is come on, man, how stupid do you have to be? But surprisingly, Bernie never tries to escape. Nothing happens there. They talk about the idea of dying. They're kind of... Kyle's asking him, are you afraid? And blah, blah, blah. They have some philosophical discussions about the topic. And I don't know. I don't remember much about this scene, because there is something about the script where... some scenes just kind of come and go, and this is one of them. It almost feels like a pad out scene. It's we're supposed to get to know Bernie a little more, but it doesn't do much for that kind of thing. And I'm trying to find... I thought I had taken an... Oh, yeah, actually I did. I did take some notes, or I took a screenshot of the script. So they're playing, and Bernie Bernie keeps winning, and he's bad idea to play against a man with nothing to lose. Dead men don't bluff. And Kyle's does that bother you, dying? And Bernie's when I look at it from the outside, then I know I probably deserve it. I just wish they did it back then. And Kyle's what do you mean? And he's well, once found this magazine in the prison library. I'm going to say it in this little accent, because they always talk about everybody has an accent. Article in it said that all the cells in our body replace themselves every 7 years. But 10? He's don't know if it's true. Well, then that means this hand, and he raises his hand. This hand ain't the same one that held the knife that killed those people. And basically, he's I wish they would have killed me back then, because, I deserve it, but I've had the time to sit here and dwell on it now, and now I know I'm a different person. I can kind of regret what I did. And he's that's kind of the worst part about it, is they let you know that you did a bad thing, and then they kill you, which is a great scene. It's a great little moment. It's one of the better scenes of getting to know Bernie, because he doesn't actually get a lot of attention in the script. The script is actually I thought the whole thing was going to take place in the area where they kill the guy, and it was all going to be this whole movie takes place within the span of hours, but it gets stretched out into days, and that wasn't what I was expecting. But in the end, I did end up loving it anyway. So yeah, that's where that scene ends, back at the cabin. And so Josie wakes up and sees her mom combing the carpet. Just another crazy scene with her mom. She's literally just combing it, trying to pick out a bunch of shit. So we see the sheriff, and he's talking to Stan and Josie, and he puts Stan on suspension, and then basically saying that he knows it was him that left the car door open and allowed Bernie to get away, and blah blah blah. And then he tells Stan to leave the office, and then when he's gone, he's basically propositioning Josie like, hey, you know, I can make this a lot easier for you if you you know what I mean. And I definitely thought it was going to be a proposition for a blowjob, but it's definitely, he just wants to like date her. He wants to be with her, and she's not interested. He's like, oh no, like I'm not looking to start anything up right now. And they kind of get interrupted by the lawyer busting in and saying that he got the stay of execution. And so the sheriff kind of just kicks them both out. So the next scene is Stan. So earlier in the movies, like after they had hidden Bernie at the cabin, Stan was talking to somebody on the phone asking about how they do the executions, what they use, blah, blah, blah. And he was taking notes. And now we find out that, then we later find out that Stan's wife is a nurse. So in this scene, Stan shows up at the hospital to surprise his wife. But in reality, he brings her flowers and he wants to take her out to lunch, but she's still got some time left on the clock. So he's like, oh, well, I'll just kind of walk around, and when you're done, we'll go out. But what he's actually doing is he's looking for the supplies to do the execution himself. So he goes into a supply closet and he's digging around and he finds what he's looking for, but as soon as he finds it, she opens the door and he just kind of drops the vial of stuff in the flowers so she doesn't see it. And he's like, oh, I was walking around and I got all lost, and somehow he got lost at a closet. But she believes it, and they leave and they go out to lunch. So in between that scene, the sheriff calls Josh and tells Lisa to stay away from the TV for a while because she's going to find out about the stay of execution. So then we come back and Stan has to get the vial out of the flowers. They're out to lunch, and it's kind of a ridiculous little scene where he's holding on to the flowers, and the waitress comes out and is like, oh, what pretty flowers. And she's like, yeah, my husband brought them to me for work. And the waitress is like, oh, you want me to put them in some flowers? And he's like, no. And like everybody, of course, is looking at him. And he's like, oh, no, we just need some garlic bread first. And then while the waitress is gone, he starts talking shit about his wife's hair, telling her to go fix it in the mirror. And so he, as you know, gets the table cleared and has to dig the vial out of the flowers and ends up cutting himself. And it's kind of a ridiculous little scene, but it adds a little bit of tension here. And so, like, the waitress comes back. It's like, yeah, here's your fucking garlic bread, asshole. At least that's in the script, it's the notes of, like, that's the implication of it, but that's not what she says. She's just like, here's your garlic bread, and kind of throws it on the table. And then, yeah, the wife comes back, and he's got the vial, and we're all good. So then we transition into one of the more interesting scenes in the movie for me, which is a very obviously a dream sequence. And it's the sequence where we see how Bernie killed Lisa's parents. And it's a really trippy dream sequence where she's like a little kid and she goes into the bathroom and finds her dad dead, and she like turns off the lights, and then she goes into her mom's bedroom and crawls into bed, but then reaches down under the blankets and sees that she's all bloody but is like snuggling with her dead body, and then she wakes up. And it's the way it's described in the script. It sounds really dark and interesting, and I really liked picturing the dream sequence. I thought it was a really good little addition of horror almost to the story. And we later learn like exactly what the situation was. She was a little girl and he killed her parents, and they never say why. Like, that's never covered. Like, Bernie needs a little more development. We never understand why he killed them. So what happened is he killed her parents, and he's walking down the hallway, like leans down and puts the knife up to her neck, and then doesn't do it. Like, he just leaves. But she sees his face and is later able to identify him. But after this dream sequence, she wakes up, and there's actually like a bunch of blood in their bed. Like, something is wrong with her pregnancy, which was a great scene. Like, the violence in the dream compacted with the violence of her waking up and what happened to her baby, and they run to the hospital, and it's really great. So after that scene, the sheriff is shown checking out the prison where he runs into one of the workers there, Rick, who's like now kind of like a janitor, but he used to be a deputy, and they talk to each other, and we find out that Rick is the one that Stan was talking to when he was asking about, you know, the execution stuff. And it's kind of implied that, oh, Stan seems really broken up about the whole thing happening, and everybody knows he's suspended now, and it kind of paints Stan as being maybe a little feeling responsible and maybe a little suicidal. So it's kind of at this point, it was like I'm starting to try to put things together, and I'm like, how, you know, by the end of this script, are they all going to get away with it, and are they going to is a lot of things just going to work out? But it didn't exactly play out exactly how I predicted, which was nice about the script. It kept me guessing. So Josh and Lisa are in the hospital, and June sees Josh and is talking to him, and he lets it drop that Stan was suspended because the sheriff had called them and told him that the cop responsible was suspended. So June's kind of like, well, where is he going if he's suspended? Like, where he's not going to work, so what has he been doing? So then we cut to another really favorite scene of mine where Josie comes home to find her mom has completely trashed the house. Like, it looks like somebody just fucking tore the place down. And she's like on the couch, and Josie's really broken up. Like, why did you do this? Like, and she's clearly like at wit's end with her mom, who just doesn't understand what's going on. And all of a sudden she just snaps and tries suffocating her mom with a pillow. And it's one of these things like, oh my God, is she like imagining this? But the scene just keeps going on. It's like, no, like she's actually doing this. She's trying to kill her mom because she's just so upset. And then she stops and lets go and like just runs down the hallway and locks herself in the bathroom as her mom is like, fuck you, you bitch, you tried to kill me. And she's like beating on the door. And Josie just like flips out and dumps all of her Adderall down the toilet, which at this point, the Adderall thing had only come up like one other time. Like, there's not a heavy use of the Adderall addiction in the script, but when it shows up, it's effective. So, you know, she gets a call from Kyle or from Stan, and telling her to meet him, you know, at the cabin. And so she opens the door, and her mom is completely stopped and completely forgotten about it, and asks if she's going to make dinner. And she's just like, yeah, you know, I'll make you something. And that was like one of my favorite scenes in the movie, just to see somebody like her at her fucking wit's end trying to take care of her mom, who she clearly loves. And just the way it plays out of her trying to suffocate her and then her mom just forgetting. Like, that's what I talk about. Like, mental illness portrayed well is just something that's so crazy for me, and so like it really manipulates my emotions. So I really enjoyed that scene. So Stan is leaving his house with the equipment to do the execution, and his wife confronts him about being suspended. She's like, well, where are you going if you're suspended, and blah blah blah. And he's just like she wants to see inside his bag, and he just rips it out of her hands like, look, we'll talk when I get back. And he leaves. And as he leaves, we see that the sheriff follows him. And so Jody makes it to the cabin, and then Stan shows up, and then all of a sudden they see that the sheriff is coming. And so Josie and Kyle hide inside while the sheriff is talking to Stan. And the sheriff's actually like showing concern, like, hey man, like, what are you doing? And seems kind of worried about him, but when Stan won't let him inside, it kind of becomes an issue. And Josie decides to take something for herself, and she gets all undressed into like a nightgown, and she comes outside and basically makes it look like her and Stan are having an affair. And this obviously pisses off the sheriff because he was propositioning her earlier, and she's like, no, I don't want to start anything right now. And he's just like, yeah, So he gets all pissed off and he takes off. And as he's leaving, June calls him to like see if he knows what's going on with Stan, and he tells her that he just saw him and Josie at the cabin. So then we're back in the cabin, and actually no. Before that, we see that Lisa has had her baby, and she finds out that the appeal of the execution. And honestly, this whole subplot doesn't go anywhere. It's like I understand we need someone to care about Bernie being killed and like seeking out justice, but literally it's just they have this kid, and it's like a back and forth of like, oh, like Josh doesn't seem to really want to have Bernie executed, but he loves Lisa and knows what she's going through, so he doesn't really know what to do. So we go back to the cabin, and we hear a little story about Stan talking about Josie and Kyle's dad, who we found out he robbed a bank and died, which, again, we never really see how it relates to their characters, other than we know that Kyle was in prison. He was talking to Bernie, and Bernie was like, yeah, you've been in prison, you kind of cover your food, and I know you can talk to me, we can relate, and that pisses Kyle off at one point. But we find out that he was in prison for just stealing or renting cars and scrapping them for parts, and then we find this out about their dad, and it doesn't. They don't do a good enough job of relating it to Josie and anything of what they're going through, and it just seems like, oh, here's some character depth for the sake of character depth, but it doesn't actually go anywhere. But then they're gonna set up for the execution. So they have Bernie lay down on the table, and as they're trying to do it, Bernie's just like, hey, can we put on some music? And so they put on a song, which was a song that I did not know. But I do want to look it up, and maybe I'll lay it in here. So as they're doing this, Stan is the one trying to insert the concoction into his veins, and he just can't hit a vein. He keeps trying over and over again. Then he's like, oh, maybe I should just try the other arm. Oh, and the song is Sister Golden Hair by the band America. So I don't know what that song is, but I'm going to look that song up. But yeah, so after he keeps repeated failings, Kyle and Josie start protesting, they shouldn't do this because they're not going to execute him anymore, so we shouldn't execute him because it's not right. And Stan's like, no, they're going to execute him, it's just going to take a little longer. It's but their original plan is to do it when it was going to be done originally, so then they wouldn't feel guilty. And this leads to Kyle and Stan fighting. And then Stan gets knocked out and falls face first into the fireplace, and his face just starts getting burned, and they pull him out, and they basically think he's dead, which is a really this is where it's spiraling out of control. But yeah, so June, that scene already happened. So this is actually the part after this happens is when June calls the sheriff and he tells her about the affair. She grabs her car keys and she leaves. And then we see that Kyle and Josie have brought Bernie to Josie's house so they can hide him out there. And they're trying to figure out what to do to help him. And so Josie calls the lawyer, and for no reason at all, they mention that the lawyer's in a hotel with a woman that's obviously not his wife, which again doesn't matter at all. And they ask him, what would happen if Bernie made it to Canada, and he says they wouldn't extradite him because for capital punishment case, they don't extradite people. And he's like, I feel obligated to tell you that if you're helping him, you're kind of in violation of the law, and they just hang up on him. So their goal is to get Bernie to Canada, because then they won't extradite him. He'll just spend the rest of his life in prison up there, and it's better for everybody. So they pack a bunch of shit, and they start to take him. They call Josie's Aunt Maggie over to take care of the mom, and we do get a couple scenes where with the mom and Kyle, because he clearly hasn't seen her in a while, and it's kind of one of those things of she doesn't recognize him, and it's a little hard for him, but it again doesn't really go anywhere. So there was an APB put out for Kyle's truck, or for Stan's truck, I'm sorry, which they took. And so as they're driving heading towards Canada, the truck gets spotted. And instead of pulling over, they decide to run. And then they end up losing these cops. And while this is going on, the sheriff is starting to get something's going on. So he goes and starts investigating the scene of where they originally hit the guy. Although, kind of looking for whatever he can find. At this point, Kyle and Josie and Bernie are hiding out in the woods when a border patrol catches up with them and is like, hey, you guys are pretty close to the border, so we're just, checking up on you. Do you have any ID or whatever? And for some reason, Kyle stupidly sprays them in the face with this bear repellent that he had grabbed, for no reason at all. They're saying that he doesn't even have to show them ID or whatever, but they're obviously it'd make it easier if you did because you are so close to the border. And they say they're just out hunting, but Kyle just seems to escalate it for a reason that seems unnecessary. But he takes down the two cops, but they have a German Shepherd with them who starts chasing them. And then we cut back to the sheriff. He finds a phone out at the accident scene, which obviously it's the guy who got hit's phone. So then we cut back to the woods, and Kyle's running and ends up getting his leg caught between some rocks and breaking it like really bad. And then the dog starts attacking him, but Bernie comes back and crushes the dog's skull and saves him. So the sheriff goes back to the cabin. Oh, I just want to make sure So the sheriff puts he tries to turn on the phone, but it doesn't work, obviously, because it's been out in the snow and everything. And then he takes the SIM card out of the phone and puts it in his and just like dials a number, and they're like, "Oh my God, like Charlie, we've been looking for you. Where have you been?" And the sheriff's just like, "Who's Charlie?" And like, explain to me what's going on. And so you can tell he's kind of putting it all together here. So then back out into the woods, they're trying to get Kyle's leg out, but he just can't. So they send Bernie off on his own to go to Canada. And Josie is sitting there trying to help get his leg out. So the sheriff goes back to the cabin June goes to the cabin and finds Stan's like burned body, and she's like, "Oh my God, like, are you okay?" or whatever. And he turns out to still be alive, but he starts asking for Josie. And so obviously that makes it seem like they are definitely having an affair, and June is super pissed. And so what she does is she just picks up the radio that's in there and crushes his head and kills him, because it looks like he's having an affair, and it's pretty obvious when he's calling for Josie. So then the sheriff ends up showing up, and the cabin at this point is like completely ablaze, and June is just sitting in her car, and he's like trying to get answers out of her, and she's just like, "I killed him," and then just rolls up her window and like ignores him. So we're back out in the woods. Kyle's like dying, and him and Josie are kind of sharing some moments together, but he's telling her to go and she won't. And then we see that Bernie makes it to the Canadian border and is trying to, like, "Hey, these people need your help," but they obviously recognize him right away as the escaped prisoner. And this is the point where the script that I believe could go through some changes. So Bernie ends up getting tasered, and then he wakes up in a hospital and starts going crazy, like, "Hey, did you help them?" Like, and they end up plunging a needle into his ass and knocking him out. And then it goes to him being executed, and everybody comes there and they watch him get executed, and they're asking if he has any last words or anything. And he's trying to get something out, and like it's implied that he's like whispering something, and then the sheriff leans in to hear what he has to say, and then it just cuts to black, and they're like, it hangs on black for a really long time, keeps hanging on black, and then all of a sudden it cuts to a helicopter in the woods with a light shining on Kyle and Josie, and the helicopter lands, and they rescue them, and they're leaving, and Josie's like, "How did you find us?" or whatever, and he says Bernie told them everything right before the execution, like told them where to find them. And she asks, she's like, "Well, will you take care of, like, will you help Kyle or whatever?" Or she's like, "Well, what happens now?" And the sheriff's like, "We forget about it. We forget about it and just go on with our lives." And he's like, "Together," kind of adding the caveat of like, "Hey, you be with me and I'll take care of you, and nobody has to know anything beyond this." And she refuses. And she's like, "No, like, I can't run from my problems anymore." And so they're like, "All right." She's like, "Well," he's like, "Can you make sure that Kyle is taken care of or whatever, and that he can be set to take care of my mom?" And he says that he can do that. And the helicopter just kind of flies off into the sunset, and that's where it ends, implying that she's going to go to jail for the running over of the guy, possibly the death of Stan, and it's it's crazy. It's a crazy ending. It's not the way I saw it going. I feel like in the end that I thought maybe that she was going to die. They were all going to kill each other at the cabin. I thought Bernie was going to have more to do with it, but in the end, he's just kind of like a good guy, and it wasn't what I expected at all. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really good movie. It would make a really good dramatic movie at some point. I really hope this script gets made. I don't even know who I would cast. Honestly, for Stan, as I was reading it, I kept picturing the guy from Office Space who gets fired because he's like, I deal with the customers because they don't have to. Like he has great people skills. The jump to conclusions Matt guy. I pictured him. Like, I don't know if that actor's still around, still alive, or what's up with him. But I that was one person I pictured. I couldn't really, like, in my head as I was reading it, I didn't see anybody for Josie. Kyle could be anybody kind of fitting the Aaron Paul status. Like, actually, Aaron Paul would actually be a good person. But yeah, Josie's kind of the one casting that I couldn't see who would fit. I feel like you need somebody a little older, like late 30s, somewhere in that range. So I wasn't really sure who could fill that role. Somebody who could definitely seem like they've been through some shit, as Josie has. But I really love this script. Great Falls was not what I expected. If I had the chance to do it, like if this was handed to me and tell me to rewrite it to make it a smaller movie, more affordable, I think the whole thing would be they run over the person and they have to decide. Like, it becomes a debate between the two cops, and one of them's like, we have to kill him. The other one's like, we don't. And then one cop helps Bernie escape, and it's the other cop hunting them in the woods. And in the end, maybe they all die. Like, maybe Bernie tricks them into killing each other and then kills the one that survives, but then he wanders out and gets found by cops and killed, or killed by a bear or something. I don't know. Like, it seems like it's one of those things that could just end poorly for everybody, and it would be really entertaining. But that's my opinion on Great Falls. That was one of the scripts. I'm so glad I read this one, and I will throw it up on the Tumblr, shelved film podcast.tumblr.com. If you want to read it for yourself, I highly recommend that you do. I think it's also pretty easy to find if you just want to Google it. But I hope you enjoyed this solo episode. It's definitely a little different, a little more just, hey, let's run through the script. But I don't have anybody to bounce off of, so. But it's a good script. That was how I would do it. What would you do differently about the script? What would you change? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Let us know at our email, shelvedfilmpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you want to let us know on Twitter or Instagram, you can find us there at Shelved Film Podcast. Or, I'm sorry, Shelved Podcast, I believe, is our Twitter and Instagram. I always forget that film is just in the Gmail and the Tumblr. But yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. Next week, I know I had promised the Star Wars commentary coming up, which that is going to come up. We are actually going to record that this weekend, maybe actually later tonight as I record this. But next week is actually going to be It, to coincide with the release of the new reboot of It, which looks fucking awesome in theaters. There was a script that was out in like 2014, so I'm actually going to rewatch the original miniseries because honestly, I don't know if I've ever seen the whole thing. I've never been really a big fan of it, but this new movie looks great, so we're going to cover It, and it might be a solo one again. I do have a guest lined up, but it all depends on because it's such short notice because I forgot I had the script, and it's like, oh shit, we have a week to like get this shit nailed down. But so we are going to try to cover that, and that'll be our episode for next week. The final Star Wars commentary will be the week after for Return of the Jedi. But that's going to be it for this episode, and thank you all for listening, and be sure to check back next week when we talk about Stephen King's It.